Welcome to Let's Be Perfectly Queer, a queer podcast creating space to talk about all things queer. My name is Archie, and I am joined today by Dr. Anna Baeth and Ellie Roscher.
Questions of how you identify, seeking answers to clarify. Whether you're queen
or somewhere in between, let's be perfectly queer.
Anna Baeth is a feminist scholar, collegiate coach, and former two-sport college athlete whose research focuses on gender, sport, and social movements. She also holds an MS in exercise and sports studies from Smith College and a PhD in kinesiology from the University of Minnesota. And Ellie Roscher, author, writing, and yoga teacher, and former two-sport college athlete who has coached gymnastics and softball. She holds an MFA in writing from Sarah Lawrence College and an MA in theology from Luther Seminary. On today's episode, we are going to be talking to Dr. Anna Baeth and Ellie Roscher and their book, Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
This is such a great book and something that's so needed right now. And so thank you for writing it and thank you for doing something like this. And for our listeners who might not know anything that's going on in the trans space or might be new to this conversation, can you each introduce yourself and how you came to work in a trans-inclusive space, especially in sport?
Totally. I'll begin. My name is Ellie Roscher. I'm so happy to be here. I'm a writer and a teacher. Right now I'm teaching yoga and teaching writing, and I love writing books. And my last book, I interviewed people who have interesting body stories, interesting things that have happened to their bodies. And I got to interview a couple of trans and non-binary folks, and I was just fascinated with their body stories and how articulate they were because, at least the people I interviewed were so in tune with shifts in their bodies, and they're just like so awake and alive. That's one of the nuggets. I also was a high school teacher, and I had transgender students who needed my support and advocacy. And this was before we saw all of these bans start to come out. I competed in 2 college sports. And so I started gymnastics when I was 4. I have no memory of my life without sports. I love them so much. So you put all of these things together. When I start seeing in the US that we're banning trans kids, that we're banning trans adults from playing in sports, kind of all 3 of those things came together. I was so mad. And I didn't buy into the story that was coming through the media that trans athletes that it was unsafe or that it was unfair, because I knew these trans folks who were pretty vulnerable in our society. And it's like I knew the people before I knew the issue. And I just believe that play is a human right. And I can see the power of sports, why it's so important to give kids and adults access to that play, that sense of belonging. And then the other part is that I met Dr. Baeth and she's leading this in research. And so we decided to come together and try to have a project that has both stories and really good information. So the hat that I kind of wore in this project is sitting at the feet of trans athletes, asking them these body questions, listening really, really hard, and really allowing the trans athletes finally to speak for themselves. One of the things we've been saying over and over again is that we're talking about trans athletes without talking to them. And so that was our number one move with this book, is talking to trans athletes who wanted to share their stories. And those stories changed me forever. And that's kind of the heartbeat of this book, Fair Game. And I'll pause for there. Otherwise, I'll keep going for the whole hour. Dr. Baeth, you're up.
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, first, thanks so much for having us on. I'm Dr. Anna Baeth. I use she, her pronouns. For those who are listening in, who maybe can't see me, I am a cisgender white woman. And you can probably tell from our accents that Ellie and I are both Americans. But how I came to this work is essentially I was finishing my PhD. I was studying sport. My background is really in sport and athletics. And I was looking for a job. And I was hired by an LGBTQ rights organization, focuses in sport. And right as I was hired, within, I would say about 6 months, all of a sudden, trans athletes were in the news everywhere. None of us really saw it coming. And I will say at that point, because I had just started this job, I didn't really know a lot about trans athletes. I knew a lot about sports. And I think I knew a lot about gender in sports, but I really didn't know much. And all of a sudden, I was getting all of these calls, people asking me, hey, you do research, you're in this space. What do we know about trans athletes? And so I essentially spent about 5 years just doing as much research as I possibly could on the subject. And as I was doing that work, I was realizing that all of the data I was coming to, all of the findings that I had, I was presenting them to politicians, to lawmakers, to sport governing bodies, and it wasn't moving the needle. And so actually, Ellie, Ellie and I also were running buddies. We lived about a mile apart from each other when we started this book. So we were out for a run one day and I was talking about my frustrations. And we decided, okay, well, then let's talk about how we move the needle. And we wrote this book with the idea that we want to present the stories of trans athletes to the world. And we also want to back it with data, but you can't have one without the other. So that's really how the book came together. And I have to say, we were running in the winter in Minnesota, and it was so cold. I don't even know. I feel like we were throwing ideas out there back and forth, mostly because I was just in a frozen brain state.
That's right. We're hardy folk.
Yeah.
In Minnesota.
Definitely. In Australia, especially WA and West Australia, it is summer right now. So thinking about that is a bit crazy. It gets very hot, and anything below like 6 degrees here, which I'm not sure what that is Fahrenheit, we're like, nah, we just stay inside.
Nah. Yeah.
So, it's very crazy when we see those things across the world, and it's very, very different. But going back to the book before I get distracted by the weather, I love the human aspect to it. And you don't see that. It wasn't just stats and statistics and here's all the data. I love that there was that human aspect. So it gives that humanity to trans people, which I do feel like some people are missing out on. When I was reading it as a trans man, I could relate so much as well to what they're going through and how their brain works. I was like, this feels like this could be my story, which was a bit crazy as well. And I love that aspect. So well done on that end.
Amazing. That's so good to hear. The stories are incredible. And I also think it's really beautiful how varied they are. So often we want a singular story, but trans folks don't want to be put into boxes, right? And so even the variance between the stories are so, so, so beautiful. And I think that's important when we're talking about policy, because we have to have more nuanced conversations of like, bodies are complex and so are sports. And so it kind of depends on how old you are and what sport you're in and what is your experience of your gender, your body, your sex. So I loved meeting all these trans athletes who came forward to be part of the project. And I think the diversity within their stories is one of the strengths of the book, for sure.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And we hear a lot of fear-based language around trans athletes, especially in the news and social media. But what are the biggest myths you see repeated, and what does the data actually say?
Okay, so Baeth, I'm going to set you up. I'll put up a myth, and then you give us some good data. You debunk it.
Okay.
So we created a master lie that we've been hearing. And I did call them myths, but I always like to say I love mythology. Like I love myths, and this is doing harm. So it's like, you get what I mean, but like, I'm just going to say lies. Okay. So there's a big master lie that in the book we break down into pieces. Okay. And the first is that transgender athletes are coming in droves. There's a disproportionality aspect to this, where there are more bands of trans athletes than there are trans athletes. And so this part of the lie, that there's this wave of trans athletes who are coming to take over, we'll say specifically women's and girls' sports, is supposed to do work to incite a moral panic. And I'll say that the moral panic will work, that fear can be activated when you're working in a structure where there's scarcity, right? And so they're coming in droves is a lie. And it's being believed because it has become a moral panic. Baeth, go. Part number one. What do you got?
Yeah, that's most of it. I mean, I think it's important to say, trans athletes make up less than 1% of all athletes across the board. And realistically, the number is closer to about a half of 1%. So we are talking about really a handful of people. And what Ellie just mentioned is the reality is last year there were 13 times more anti-trans bills proposed across the United States than there were out trans athletes. Do we need 13 bills per person? I think not.
I think not.
I think not. And a lot of that is because if we can talk about the bills, then we can create this idea and this sensibility and this sense of fear or this moral panic. But really the impetus behind a moral panic is by creating a moral panic, certain lawmakers are then also saying, not only should you be afraid, but you should turn to me and vote for me and give me money because I am the one who can solve this problem, right? So the irony abounds there because also these lawmakers have never cared about women's sport, right?
Or women. Any women.
Yeah. Yeah.
Women's bodies. Okay. Can we say that? Okay. Keep going.
The next myth that we really debunk 4 in the book. The next one is that they're stealing scholarships and medals. This is simply not true. A trans athlete has not been awarded a scholarship in the United States in place of a cis athlete. No trans athlete has won an Olympic medal. I'm not sure what else there is to say about that, except that it's just not true. But again, it's another myth that fuels that fear.
And I think what's going on behind the lie that they're stealing medals, what's underneath that is that it's unfair. What they're actually saying when they're saying that is it's unfair for a trans woman to compete against a cis woman. And what's underneath that, like you just keep excavating it. There's this belief that women's bodies are inferior and need to be protected. And I, as a cis woman, am divesting from that. I don't need that protection. Let me go. Let me compete. Let me compete against anyone who wants to compete with me, right? So what we need to look at, we're laser focused right now on testosterone, but the studies are not good. The numbers are not good. They are inconclusive, right? That testosterone in cis men and cis women overlap a great deal. We have not studied transgender athletes' bodies, right? We don't have good information about the correlation between testosterone and athletic performance. And Dr. Baeth taught me to always think about it's not about the level of testosterone in your body. It's about receptors and how testosterone acts in your body. So we need to learn a lot more about hormones. And as a cis woman, I'm super interested in learning more about hormones, right? We want to have a really intelligent conversation about fairness in sports. We need to keep our eye on the prize of like, why is sports unfair? It has to do with money and it has to do with race. So if you're not willing to talk about capitalism, then you can't be part of this conversation, right? That sports is unfair and the athletic advantage, the competitive advantage, which is different than an athletic advantage, is going to folks who have money to have access to good facilities, good coaches, good training. They have that stability. And so I go so far as to argue that being cis is a competitive advantage because you hear these trans athletes talking about having to be vigilant to keep themselves safe in this binary sports world. Baeth, you want me to keep going for 3? Here we go.
Keep going.
For 3, we have to take a pause because it gets heavier fast. We make a point in the book that all 4 of the lies are doing harm. This one is doing harm at a very different level. And so we kind of just have to like move a little bit slower because the 3rd lie is that they're coming in droves to steal your medals and do harm. And that harm is in 2 different areas. One, we're talking collision sports, right? So that goes back to policymakers having the audacity to say that they want to protect the bodies of cis women athletes who are not asking for that protection. We love collision in sports. Why do we believe that the female body can't handle that, right? So that's one aspect of harm. But then this other aspect of harm is around this idea of like locker rooms. And it's super, super important to debunk that lie and get crystal clear on where the harm is. So the question underneath that is it safe? We want to have that conversation. We are desperate to build a safer sports system for our kids and for our adults. And it is absolutely not trans athletes who are doing the harm. Baeth, what do you got?
I think to add to that a few points. When we talk about who's winning in this system, the people who have always won in sport are the same people who are still winning, right? To Ellie's point, it's the people who have the money and the access. That is very clear, right? Like, as much as we don't know about testosterone, what we know is what makes somebody really good at elite sport, and it comes down to resources, bottom line. When we talk about this idea of safety, I think it's important to name too that myth really triggers fear in a pretty visceral way for a lot of folks. And I will say for me as a cis woman, yeah, there is some fear in locker rooms. It's not around trans athletes, right? A lot of the fear that I have felt in sports spaces is frankly around cisgender men. So the conflation of trans women with cis men who are aiming to do harm, I think we need to name that that's what it is. But also, I actually think it's a really interesting moment to then say, okay, well, if we want to talk about the harms that are being done in sport, let's talk about them. And let's talk about the rampant harassment, abuse. And that's not all athletes and it's not all sports, but it's everywhere, right? So if we really want sport to be more fair, safer, let's get to the heart of what's actually making sport not fair and not safe. And I think the other bottom line from our book is quite simply, these myths, these lies are doing way more harm, way more lasting harm than trans athletes ever have, ever will, right? I mean, we are talking about the next 10 to 50 years of sport. And I mean, beyond sport, if we're talking about just access to social institutions that people who are not cisgender have, we're talking lifetimes here.
Yeah.
That's a problem. That's a problem for me.
You touch on a lot of good points there. And I think it also stems down to the patriarchy, and men don't like to lose to women. That's what it is. And so they feel if a trans woman comes in, that 100%. It really messes with their brain, and they want any excuse to not have a trans woman in the sport. And I was looking at recently, I think it was a Chinese cis female athlete. It was some shooting in the Olympics.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, clay pigeon shooting. And the fact that she beat all the men and then they had to divide it. Not because they had to divide the genders because of fairness to the women. It was because the men didn't want to lose to the women. So I think if you think about it, it does stem back to the patriarchy. And then you see on all the social media, all these people who are trying to protect women's sport who can't name a single female athlete.
Preach.
Which is absolutely insane. It just shows that the patriarchy feeding these minds and saying this is the way it is, they're here to take everything. And there was the New Zealand weightlifter. I remember there was a lot of issues when she came onto the scene. She didn't even pass the first round. And they're like, she's going to steal all the medals. And she was like, I just want to compete. I love the sport. And a lot of the times with the trans athletes, they just want to compete in the sports they love. And it's really that simple. But the media love to take anything. And clickbaits have been around since, the 1800s, because everybody loves something that's going to grab their attention. And for some reason, people love trans people in the news. They love to read about it, write all these hateful comments, but they've never met a trans person in their life, or they probably don't realize that they've met a trans person. And so you've got all this kind of stuff. And to use the bathrooms, that's all you want to do. You want to use the bathroom in the change rooms. You don't want to go in there and do anything else. I know as a trans man, when I first started using male bathrooms, first, they're disgusting. They're absolutely disgusting. They stink. They're gross. It's the one bad part about transitioning was the toilet situation. You don't think about that. It's next level. It's next level. But you do freak out going to the bathroom because you're like, wait a minute, this feels weird. And, and as trans women, they've already got so much anxiety.
Yeah.
And a lot of them end up with, UTIs or different things because they don't want to use the bathroom because they feel scared to make other people scared, which is crazy. It's just people want to play sport and they want to use the bathroom in the change room. That's it. There is nothing else to it.
That's right. Gosh, that's so refreshing. Yes.
And I would take it one step further and say, what if we took all of that time and energy and money that we put into vilifying trans athletes and we, I don't know, paid to have clean bathrooms, right? Like, or whatever it might be. I mean, that's part of the infuriating part for me, right? It's why are we wasting so much time on something when we could be actually using our energy to affect real change and to make sport and all social systems healthier, not just for trans folks, but, to your point about the patriarchy, God, I mean, I don't know what it means to be a man in this system, any of these systems, but to be so afraid of losing.
Yeah.
When we talk about fear, I mean, it's coming from somewhere. And for me, I empathize. I feel for little cis boys who are taught that they have to be so afraid to first identify with womanhood at all.
Yeah.
E.g., like if you become a trans woman, that's a major problem. But also you have to be so afraid of losing to women because that says something about you. I think the point that I'm just trying to make is this is not just about trans athletes.
That's right.
Right? And it's not even just about cis women and it's not even just about cis girls. This is about everybody who touches sport and is affected by it.
Yes.
And you're talking about money. It is like, look, wasting so much money and time and resources. And you mentioned before, trans athletes make up less than 1% of the participants, but there are hundreds of bills targeting them. What do you think is the real driving level of this political attention to trans athletes?
Well, for me, the bottom line is this is about controlling bodies.
That's right.
And it's the idea of whose bodies can we control? How much work do we need to do to control bodies? And once we start controlling some, who else can we control?
That's right.
Right? I mean, it's about controlling bodies. It's about a lack of bodily autonomy. It's no coincidence that reproductive rights in the United States have been redacted at the same time that these laws are being passed around trans athletes. It's not lost on us that it's not just trans folks losing access to medical care and the education system. It's also people who cannot afford insurance, right? I mean, this is all about who is being given access to be in their bodies healthfully, safely, and who's not.
Yeah.
And who benefits from that.
When we gotta pull the very recent history books out and take a look at abortion, and how that was used and exploded in politics. You said about clickbait, right? Like there is something about if you say you're going to protect girls from transgender athletes, it works. And when you push, these folks who are saying that don't know what they're talking about. And the sad thing is that they don't have to. Like if they just say it, they get power and money and votes. So we have to take a really serious look at that moral panic and like what is underneath it, pushing that fear where you say this lie and it's working. So stories are constantly doing work in our society, whether they're true or not. So, John A. Powell uses the example of like, there's a story in our country, in the United States, that Black men are dangerous. And regardless of what the data shows, that is a story that our society has chosen to believe. Now that is working with transgender athletes as well. And numbers aren't shifting that untrue story. So we have to tell more beautiful stories to get ourselves out of the one that we're stuck in. And telling that story, because we live in such a highly capitalistic society and there's so much money in sports, that if you follow the money, it becomes clear who is telling this lie and what they are benefiting from it. And then who is being harmed by it. And we have to just get so clear about who's actually vulnerable in our society and needs that support. If we start policing sex and policing that female category, like sex is so complicated, right? So to maintain this pristine women's category, any woman who's not performing gender obediently is going to be under the microscope. And that inordinately is usually women of color, for example. And so we have to see like who's going to be spending the money to maintain that pristine women's category and what bodies are going to get shoved to the side and deeply harmed. That doesn't look like protecting girls to me, right? So we know that in states that support trans athletes, cis girls in those states, cis women in those states are having a better experience and they're participating at a higher rate. So we're just trying to have the actual conversation that's in the media. Let's talk about how to support all girls and women. Let's talk about creating a sports world that is more fair and more safe. And as soon as we're having conversation that's backed by actual body stories and that's backed by actual information, it becomes very clear what needs to shift. And it's not excluding trans athletes. Like all bodies deserve to play, and we all do better when we do better.
And I would even say, and we allude to this in the book, but I don't know that we talk about it outright. Trans athletes can show us a very clear future of sport. And I think that is part of why people want those voices, those stories to be erased.
That's right.
Right? And I think it comes in all different forms and fashions. But the bottom line is, you know, to Ellie's point at the very top here, we're talking to, and you hear it and you see it when you read these stories. When we talk to trans athletes, they know their bodies. They are intuitive with their bodies and with sport in ways that, frankly, I think most cisgender folks aren't, because cisgender folks haven't had to explore their bodies and identities in the same ways.
That's right.
And because of that, they offer insights into how to make sport safer, healthier, more fun.
That's right.
That I think if we took them very seriously, we would have an entirely different sporting system, one where everybody thrives.
But we'd have to dismantle the current one for it to move toward that exuberance and joy. And I'm here for it. You know, doing these interviews, I came out as cis, you know, like I did the work and I have now an active cis identity. I am way more awake and alive. People in my life noticed. And so, you know, it's those parts of our body privilege that like are dormant when we don't do that deep self-reflection. Our gender and sex is just fascinating. And I just think like it's when cis folks are willing to turn toward our own bodies and do that work, we're going to become pretty amazing advocates, because the way then becomes clear that we're working toward a world where more people are awake and alive. And I'm going to go so far as to say, like when we're talking about capitalism in the United States, the system, it's like, think about which bodies are just standing up and put cogs in the system of like, what are you going to do with me though? What are you going to do? I exist. What are you going to do with me? That's petrifying to the system. Disembodied people are so much easier to control. So when folks are dormant, their heads are down, they're going through the motions of life, they haven't come out as cis, the system can control them with these lies. If we start waking up and doing our work and becoming embodied, we're going to push back and burn it down. Let's go. And that's one of the reasons I'm so into sports, is because sports invite folks to come back home to their bodies over and over and over again. And remember that movement is medicine and the collective movement is liberation. And we need everybody at that party. We can't be excluding like the most free bodies. You're like, it's so clear to me that trans athletes have done work that have set themselves free. They're the ones leading us into this future that's more creative, more colorful, more exuberant, more joyful. I'm in. Sign me up.
Love it. And that's the way. It should be more inclusive. And then, you know, you have all different types of athletes, all different types of bodies. Then you can learn from each other. You can learn different ways, because, you know, reading in the book is that some of the athletes had to relearn how to do things in their new body. And I didn't even think about that because, I used to love futsal. And then I went to go play because I'm also a high school teacher with some of the high school kids. And I was like, this isn't as easy as it used to be. But my shoulders are a lot broader. And I didn't think about that. So the way I run, the way I move, obviously has to change. And it wasn't till I was reading the book. That's why I felt like I sucked when I used to be really good. And it didn't make sense to me. I was like, why do I feel awkward playing this? Literally, it wasn't until I was reading the book. I was like, my whole body has changed, but I didn't change any aspect of the way that I played. I used to be very thin and like speedy. And I was like, why do I feel clumsy? Why is this not working? And it totally makes sense. So we can actually learn from each other watching different genders and different trans men and women and non-binary play. And then you can actually improve your sport. And talking about improving sport, Ultimate Frisbee, such a great game. Have you played it? It's so tiring. I didn't realize how tiring Ultimate Frisbee is. It's one of the most inclusive sports. I love it. They used to do a teachers' games in WA where all the teachers got together and play sport, and one of them was Ultimate Frisbee. My team sucked, but we had a lot of fun. Everybody was on the field. We're running around. I didn't realize you ran more in Frisbee than you do in soccer, but what makes it different and why does it work?
Okay, I'm going back to my own personal story. When I was in high school, my grade is the grade that started the ultimate team at our school. And it was outside of the system. It wasn't an official sport. It wasn't under the Minnesota State High School League. And so then they governed themselves. My high school team was named Raging Safari, and they wore kilts in the championship games. And they were just like the most creative anti-institution folks in our school, and they were phenomenal athletes. They were just the ones that didn't want to opt into like what I call the alpha sports. And a lot of it is because of what Baeth said about cis boys and men and how they've been conditioned to be in the world. And so I loved that the team, they coached themselves, they reffed themselves, they called their own fouls, they had their own system of ethics, and it was outside of the capitalist system of winning. And that has continued. They've kept fighting for that. So we go back to the fact that we have to talk about money. If we're going to talk about this, who owns you? What system is going to restrict you with rules? And then there is this thing where there's just a bunch of bodies on the field moving, and so you get to decide how you're going to match up. And you get to see all the different types of athletic ability and how a team needs a bunch of different types of athletic ability. And that doesn't necessarily line up with your sex and gender, right? So yeah, we have great Frisbee stories in this book. One in particular I think is so interesting as a trans man who's having a better experience on a women's team because the culture there is like, hey, everybody's welcome on this team. We're just going to go play Frisbee, right? And so there's not the sex matching at the beginning, where he just gets to be a player on the team. So I think it's that commitment to the creativity, and it's the commitment, honestly, like to the anti-institution. They know that's what makes them cool, and they're going to fight really hard to keep it so they have that freedom of movement, not only on the field, but then within the structure, if that makes sense.
And one other little nerdy tidbit is that in Ultimate is one of the few sporting organizations that actually invited trans and non-binary athletes in their system into conversations when they were writing the rules and the policies for the sport, right? Look at that. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Turns out if you have all of the people who your system is supporting supposedly at the table, you can actually support all those people.
Yeah, love it. And what does exclusion from sports actually do to trans young people, emotionally, socially, and mentally? Because I know that I used to live soccer and futsal. And when I was presenting female, I had this great sense of belonging. It was part of my identity. And then when I made the first step in transitioning, I was like, I'm going to lose a part of myself. And that's me as an adult. In my mind, I was like, I'll go back to it. But I kind of felt, especially in the early days, like I wouldn't fit in with a men's league, and there wasn't many social leagues. Now there are more, but now my knees aren't what they used to be. It kind of took away a part of myself. So for me as an adult, it's different. But for a young person, what can that do?
Oh. Well, I'll just start with a sense of belonging. I go back to my high school students. They are experimenting with belonging outside of their family of origin. And it's this really tender stage of formation. Belonging, I argue, is a body feel. When you know you belong, that vigilance of, am I safe, can just drop away. And then you're not living in fight or flight mode. You can be in your body and move freely. I remember, I belonged to my college gymnastics team before I stepped on campus. And that shifted my body feel, is that I knew there was a group of people that had my back immediately before they even met me. And so I'll say that's for me, number one with kids is like, how dare we remove any opportunity for a kid to feel like they belong in community, that they belong somewhere, in part because of these lies. Culture feels very unsafe to them. And an inclusive sports team that the cis kids get, that they're lucky to be in proximity to, right? That there's so much value for so many different reasons for having trans kids on the team, like the big wins. I just think that is horrible. And now we're seeing that trans kids aren't going out for sports because they're not sure if it will feel safe. And thank goodness for theater departments, right? And music departments and fill in the blank, other places that are welcoming these kids in. But kids should just have a bunch of different places to explore being in their bodies as they become. And then there's amazing research that just makes sense to me as an athlete about how sports can support your mental health as well and our physical health, right? It's so good for kids to move, and it's fun to move in the context of sports. So we tell the story of a young girl who stopped playing sports because she was a trans girl and it wasn't safe. And her teacher started an unofficial running club for her because she couldn't be on a sports team. And the teacher understood movement and belonging, right? That this kid is a good athlete who deserves a place to move and belong. And so that was like a loophole that was like so inspiring to me about understanding this kid who's vulnerable at this very tender age. We're going to create a space for her to land outside of these restricted rules.
I love that. It's moving the goalposts and making sure that there's still this chance for this student to succeed in whatever they want to do. It might be a shift, but there's still a chance. But this only doesn't affect organized college sports or high school sports. It also impacts weekend sports. So with kids who just want to play on the weekend, what do these bans, like what's at stake for these kids?
Well, if we're gonna if we're gonna talk about our own personal experiences, which I think we have to, I can't imagine not having sport in my life. And I can imagine, because I talked to these parents, what it's like to say to your kid, hey, you can't do this anymore. I mean, it's devastating. But I think beyond what it does to trans kids, I think it's also what this is doing to all kids, right? I mean, to say that you should be afraid in sport in general worries me. But the bottom line is it also really raises some questions about like, okay, well then what the hell is sport for? Right? I mean, part of why I participated in sport was because when I was growing up, my parents made it very clear, like, you are going to go participate in sports or play sports that you are not good at. You're going to play with people who are much better than you. You are going to play with people who do not come from the town that you come from, who don't have the same beliefs that you have. And that is the beauty of it, right? This is your time to learn how to lose with grace, how to win with grace, how to be the best version of yourself, and how to understand that my experience is not every other person's experience, right? And so, again, I mean, I think trans kids are losing out on that, but I also think all of their teammates are losing out on that.
That's right. Proximity matters so much. you get these stories in this book in a way that I love. Like, do you remember the story where the trans man talked about being raised as a girl and being conditioned female and all of the skills that he brought to his team that boys and men are losing out on, right? So yeah, we could keep going and going. It's so much more than inclusion, right? Like everybody's losing when we are having a sports system that has others and have in and out groups. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, you're boxing people's opportunity to grow because they don't have any outside information or taking away from experiencing from others. You learn, like back when I was learning how to play soccer, I couldn't kick a ball from a corner. And so I'd ask some of the guys and the girls, I was like, what am I doing wrong? And so then I could learn from them. And, one would say this works for them, but that didn't work for me. And then one said, well, this works for them. And then I tried that and that actually works. So, you never know what you can get when you have that inclusion. And you can also, like you were saying, you're going to lose. And so you build resilience. And so then the real world doesn't affect you as much because you've got these sports and these safe areas and these safe environments to lose and know what it feels like to lose and get back up and try again and get to that point of winning or at least being the best version of yourself that you can be. Otherwise, you're missing out on these opportunities. So it is sad that all these things are in place. And it goes beyond that as well because people start to attack what is feminine, what is masculine when you start to put all these ideals of what is a trans woman and what is a trans man. And,
Yes.
we've seen it with the boxer who won the Olympics, they look too masculine to not be a cis woman when, they were a cis woman. And then you still have the president of the United States still saying that they're a trans woman when it's not true at all. And then you also have what's happening in the UK where anybody who looks too masculine to be in a women's bathroom is being attacked. It's almost giving the politicians and the patriarchy in the system, like you said, the okay to then police women's bodies and then inspect women's bodies. And that's where it's going. And it's not fair. And so then instead of these trans women and these trans kids as well wanting to compete, they're just like, for my own safety and for my dignity, I'm not going to do that. But then it only doesn't affect them as well. It affects all women athletes. And that's where it's going. And so it is sad that it is going that way. And at this time right now it is pivotal. And right now is a time for everybody to stand up and say, we aren't going to take this. There needs to be inclusion. Trans women are women, and that's it. We can't police women's bodies in general. And especially, we've got the Olympics coming up. We've got the 2028 Olympics. And I think right now, this is the pivotal moment to be like, what's going to happen? And there's all these Supreme Court cases going, especially in the US. And what do you think what do we need to pay attention to over the next few years?
I think there's what you can pay attention to, and then I think there's what you can control.
Yeah.
And I would rather talk a little bit about the latter, because I think in this moment where it feels like so much is out of our control, there still are things that we can do, right? I mean, first of all, when we're looking at the policies, stand up, speak out, right? I mean, be clear. I think a big part of what folks can do too, and what we aim to do with the book a bit, is to just help connect those dots, especially for people who maybe don't have as much of an interest in sport. Beyond that, I think there is always money.
Yeah.
And where we put our money and our attention and our energy. And are we giving money to the systems and the people who are not using it in the ways that align with our own values, right? And I think we see that a lot in sport.
So I always like to break down what we can do into different levels, because there's always things that we can do. And sometimes the systems levers just seem really big and insurmountable. And that's a real barrier, but that doesn't mean we can't flow like water to other work, right? So I'm calling out cis folks, and myself included, is like, we can always do work in our own bodies, to tell our own body stories, to come out as cis, to do our homework about what our sex is, like what our sex was assigned at birth, and then what our sex identity is and what makes up our sex, right? So we can do work on our own body and our own body stories. You can do little things like cultivate your social media feed. If you don't think you know a trans athlete, follow them, learn from them, like sit and listen hard to the longest version of the story that they're going to give. And listen with that open heart, bringing your own body stories to it. Where are the points of connection, right? So there's body level stuff you can do. There's interpersonal stuff, right? So like there's a bunch of cool cis folks underneath the stories of this book doing action. Like there's so much work to do just to create a safer culture for folks to be who they are as trans. And so like that's a daily standing up in our interpersonal relationships. And then there's institutional work we can do. What institutions are you a part of? How are their policies? What could shift? What levers could you push where you have jurisdiction at the institutional level? And then there's always the systems too, is to track what's happening on the systems level and to speak out. I just love presenting fun things we can do as well, because it's not drudgery. You know, like I've said, I have become so much more awake and alive as I've written this book and have stepped into this work. There's so much joy to be had here. One fun thing you can do is support women, support women's sports, right? Like women's sports is so fun. And there is that scarcity mindset within women's sports that are making us cling. The cis girls cling, the cis women to cling. So going in and like breathing life into women's sports so that there's that abundance mindset, that's part of doing the work. And I think that part of the work is really fun.
Yeah, and at the moment, we've got the Women's Asia Cup happening here. So I've volunteered my time to go help out because I was like, why not? Help support female sports, and they're going to need all the volunteers they can get. And so if anyone's listening, go to your local community. Do they need a coach? Do they need someone to help out on the sidelines? In women's sport, give the money back there because it is really very underfunded. When the National Soccer League started here for women, I had a few friends who were playing in the league and they got paid $150 a season. They got their flights, but it was only $150. So they had to continue working and then miss out on certain games to pay for bills and all that kind of thing. So I think it's a little bit better now, but it's still nowhere near where it needs to be. And so, women's sport is greatly underfunded. And people say, we don't watch women's sport. When they had the World Cup here, it had the highest viewing in Australian history for a sport since Kathy Freeman won the 800-meter sprint. And they say people don't watch women's sports. Like, well, they do, because more people watched the Women's World Cup here than they ever watched the Men's World Cup. And our women are ranked a lot higher than our Socceroos, but people forget that. And it's like, they're doing great. It's interesting when you see that and how far we could take sport for women if we actually gave them the support and the money that they needed. Let's finish on something positive, because this has been quite hard hitting. It's been very needed. It's definitely needed in this climate. So I want you to leave a positive message just to finish this up. So if you could say one thing directly to a trans young person who's been told they don't belong in sport, what would it be?
Oh my gosh. I would say we're better. We're better with you. We want your body story. We want your joy. We want your exuberance. And you deserve to play. You deserve to play and stay in your body and compete and win. Please come play.
Am I allowed to curse a little bit?
Of course you can.
Great. I feel like I would put my coaching hat on and be like, yeah, just go kick everybody's ass. Just like go ball out, have a great time, play super hard, have fun. I don't think it's any more complicated than that, but I would say go win. Yeah. Go win if you can.
Yeah, and go see what your body's made of. Go see what's possible, right? That's the fun part about sport, is just getting to that edge and being like, what's this body capable of? Let's go.
That's amazing. And I think that's a positive way to end it. So thank you both for coming on the show. It's something that's close to my heart, obviously being trans and seeing students who want to do things and have been told no. Thank you so much. It's been so wonderful. The book, it's great. It's Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports. It's like a personal, you're listening, almost reading personal diaries. You're getting into the world of these different athletes. And it's definitely something that I think everyone should have a read of. And it's not very long. I'm not a big reader and I was able to read it. I don't usually read more than a few pages, but I was stuck there reading it. So thank you so much to Dr. Anna Baeth and Ellie Roscher. It's been great. And you guys, I've had so much fun. I'm looking at the time, but I could literally talk for hours because I was like, oh, this is such a good conversation. I hope that the listeners enjoyed it as well. And I'll put the links to anything to your socials and where they can find you and learn a bit more about you and the book as well. So thank you so much again. It's been a lot of fun. And until next time, I hope that we have been
perfectly
clear.
perfectly queer.